So this is known as Crown of Shadows or The Reign of Queen Ginnarra. Now, lots of movies have alternate titles, but interestingly, this one has a different director credited depending on which version you watch, but they are the same version. So it was actually directed by Laurie Brewster, a Scottish filmmaker I've reviewed a couple of films from him before, and he's done a couple of kind of fantasy movies of which have been more campy. But on the British DVD of this, you've actually got a credit for someone else, Richard Campbell, this is only the only credit. So it looks like he's gone under a pseudonym on this DVD version, but on the kind of the other kind of the Reign of Queen Ginnarra, it is credited as Laurie Brewster. Don't know why. It's the same film. Anyway, what's the story? Now, I actually did a trailer reaction to this some time ago, and I noted it kind of looked a cross between 300 and Game of Thrones. 300 and some of its visual stylings, it looks like a lot of it was sort of CGI enhanced and sort of green screen and stuff like that. And then, but it certainly looked like it was having that political kind of sort of machination style that Game of Thrones have. So now I've seen the full film. What's it all about? It essentially focuses on a queen, Ginnarra, who is the kind of the ruler of this land, and she is evil. I mean, she is bad news. She is kind of Lovecraftian in nature. She seems to be like worshipping these like old gods and things, these old ones, and the dark ones, and you know they basically kind of, she rules with like through tyranny really, and has no mercy and very kind of cruel and everything, but she rules with an iron fist. But there is a rebellion, and her brother actually ends up kind of being the leader of this rebellion, and he's kind of clearly modelled after a kind of a Jon Snow sort of style sort of character. And as the film progresses, it seems that the brother is able to almost summon a dragon, but not kind of consciously. It sort of just turns up and ends up protecting him, but he can't really control it necessarily. It just seems to be out there to protect him, and through magic and stuff, our queen decides she's going to beat that by having two evil dragons and stuff. And then we have all these kind of different kind of allies from each side, some of which kind of end up double crossing and things like this, and it's lots of kind of backstabbing and political manoeuvring as the film progresses. You know, the son of Queen Ginnarra ends up being just as brutal as his mother, and ends up, you know, killing a lot of people, but ultimately turning some people towards the rebels and things. And inevitably it ends up with a final clash. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So, those of you who like fantasy or sword and sorcery movies, of which I am one, let's discuss what works in this film. Now, this is a very sort of mature film in some ways. It's not necessarily overly graphically violent or anything, but its subject matter is certainly more mature. It's not like a fun, campy romp, like sort of a lot of barbarian sort of style movies and the Deathstalkers and stuff. It takes itself quite seriously. It's also a long film. It's 2 hours 22 minutes, I believe it is. So it's quite a long film. So it's a lot about building atmosphere. And one of the things I liked about this movie is the best way I would describe it. This movie is almost like watching like meditation music or listening to meditation music, when you kind of have these, oh, in fact, to listen to like Gregorian chants or something like that. This is the movie. Gregorian chants, the movie. It's all very much kind of like, it has this sort of medieval sort of gothic atmosphere. The movie nearly has this this kind of soundtrack that is almost constant through the film, and it's all lots of chanting and sort of like sort of organ sort of style music, but it makes it feel almost like you're sort of meditating in this kind of, and just kind of, you know, it wrapped up in this kind of atmosphere, so to speak, and it's all very sort of slow pace, but again that sort of works with just this sort of bubbling sort of atmosphere. I mean, some of this stuff is very well shot. Now, Laurie Brewster being a Scottish director, and I noticed a lot of the Scottish accents in this movie, so I'm presuming it was filmed in Scotland. But it does make use of the natural environment, and there's scenes here which take place in the kind of the woodland, and it's kind of snowing. It looks great, great setting for a kind of like a, you know, medieval kind of sequences or fantasy movie kind of sort of style aesthetics and stuff. And I gotta say, I think there's some good like costuming and kind of set decoration, you know, hair and makeup, all that sort of stuff. I've got to say, again, we have to bear in mind this is a lower budget movie. This is not a mainstream production, but I've got to say some of the kind of the design here is the production design is quite impressive. Again, for a low budget movie. Now, this movie has AI enhancements, and I think in circumstances, I think in certain scenes it benefits this movie, because it kind of gives you like establishing shots of things like that couldn't exist, you know, in reality, being, you know, kind of produced and stuff in a physical manner. We've got all these gothic kind of castles and, you know, hundreds of people out in the streets and things like that. So in some aspects, I think there are examples in this movie where I do feel it can add something. Now that is a double-edged sword, which we'll come on to in a minute, but I do think there is an argument here that I think there are certain, it pluses certain things by having some kind of very sort of elaborate sort of establishing shots here and there and stuff like that. There is dragons in this movie, if you're a fan of like the Game of Thrones, you know, dragon stuff, and we have dragon on dragon battles. I think the dragon CGI is a little mixed. But there are some sequences where I feel the dragons do look pretty cool, especially when they're kind of flying through the clouds and they're slightly obscured. I think then they do come into their own. I think that our bad guys here, our queen, is deliciously evil. I mean, it's interesting to have a kind of a female antagonist who is unapologetically bad. Because quite often when you have a female villain, she's misunderstood or she's redeemed and that sort of thing. Here she's just bad news, and you know, I find that quite refreshing. And again, she doesn't speak. This doesn't have loads of lines, but she's doing this kind of like they've taken kind of some of the kind of like the hair and makeup and the design from history, but added sort of, you know, obviously this kind of fantasy spin. So I kind of quite liked it, and some of her kind of subordinates are kind of quite fun. And again, some of them are just as kind of menacing and evil as she is. And I got to say, I think in regard to the acting, I think strangely the people who are on the kind of our bad guy side, I would say the acting is reasonable. Not so much for our good guys, as we'll come on to, but for our, you know, for our villains, I gotta say, I think there's some fairly decent performances in the group and stuff, including sort of the Queen, who is just like, you know, reveling in the evilness. Is, you know, go Queen and all that. So that's kind of obviously pretty good. And like I said, if you don't mind a slower paced movie, because this is a slower paced film, which is more about building an atmosphere and having this kind of dark gothic ambience, more so than having an overt action orientated movie, then this is where this movie succeeds, because I do feel, like I said, you can almost sit back and, like, you know, just listen to it and kind of get wrapped up in the world, more so than watching it in some respects. So let's transition to what does not work in this film. So it's long, unnecessarily long. 2 hours 22 minutes. Did it need to be this long? No, it didn't. Did it? You know, could it have? Did it need to be like 70 minutes? No, it could have been longer than that. But I didn't feel it was necessary to have this length of time. I mean, I get that it has long sequences that are very kind of atmospheric, which it does create a good atmosphere. But I do feel the pacing of this movie just slows down so much, and it ends up becoming ends up a little bit dull at times, I have to say. And you kind of want the scenes to just get on with it. There are scenes here as well that I feel are just unnecessary, which leads me on to the AI. This has a lot of it, a lot of AI sequences. I would, and I haven't timed it, but I would say 10% of the sequences here, or 10% of the running time is AI. It's a lot, and a lot of it is unnecessary. A lot of it is just static scenes with the kind of animated bits in it. And that is a lot of what the action sequences are. It's like, you know, those things you get where it's like an animated still image almost. So it's not exactly like thrilling action sequences. Now, let's get into a little bit more of the AI. So there is some controversy with AI. Should filmmakers use it? I'm not against it, I will say, but I understand the argument. This is why the strikes were happening in 2024, I believe, in America. The actors' strikes and the writers' strikes, part of that was about AI. And, you know, so some people have a moral issue with it. I don't. If it's used well, I think it can benefit a filmmaker and do things that they might not be able to do. So that's not an issue for me. However, there is some clear tonal differences between what is practically been filmed and these kind of AI sequences. It looks so different. It is very jarring, I think. And I think, again, there are a couple that I think work okay, but a lot of them feel unnecessary. A lot of them look like CGI, AI created images, and they look so at odds with the sequences that have been filmed practically and on location and stuff like that, that it really is jarring when you're kind of watching this. And I think it's overly used here. And again, a lot of this could have been chopped out to reduce the running time. A lot of it was unnecessary. A lot of it just as I say, feels very artificial looking. There are some sequences that have been sort of CGI enhanced as well, and kind of like sort of almost has a sort of green screen style look to it. Again, not the best effects ever. I think the costuming is, you know, all that's kind of good, but the sort of where it's using CGI enhancements, be it AI or green screen or, you know, VFX, that's when this movie is lacking a little bit. Now, the acting, I quite enjoyed our bad guys, but our good guys, oh boy, it is weak sauce, unfortunately. Our kind of array of protagonists led by the brother, unfortunately not the best actors, really lacking in charisma. I would say the brother is not necessarily a terrible actor, but I just didn't feel he had much presence. He didn't really have a lot of charisma. He's clearly modelled after Jon Snow, but it just doesn't have any of that, you know, sort of charisma that Kit Harington brought to that role. It's made it so, you know, so watchable. It doesn't have it here. You know, he's, as I say, he's maybe not terrible acting, but it's not certainly not that dynamic either. But some of his subordinates and some of the supporting characters that we have on our protagonist side, oh, it's painful to listen to some of these performances. Really kind of quite jarring at times. As I've mentioned, I think the CGI dragons in some shots do look kind of okay. Again, we have to bear in mind this is a lower budget film. But there are times where they kind of look they look like they needed to be animated a little bit more. They're just kind of flying through the skies, and the sort of the legs and arms are just kind of static and stuff. It doesn't look like they are animated enough. And again, I understand this is a budgetary issue, but this is how it just looks on screen, I've got to say. And you know, it ultimately looks a little bit cheaper CGI because of that. So you know, It feels like Laurie Brewster, who is, you know, some of his stuff I've quite enjoyed, I've got to say, but he's fiddling around with the kind of the new technology. Don't think it's quite there yet, I have to say. It's certainly for lower budget filmmakers. It's ultimately a little bit tiresome, this film, because it does go on for so long. The performances are kind of weaker for a lot of the actors. The sequences just drag on. There's too much sort of AI, I think, and ultimately the film becomes, you know, you start to lose focus and stuff, and you're sort of watching it, and you know, you think, oh, that was a cool bit, but you're not really super engaged with it, with this film, I have to say. But there are some elements that I do like, and again, some of the production design, some of the atmosphere and stuff I like. I like how deliciously evil our bad guys are. So this is a real mixed bag for me. I've got to say I preferred some of his other fantasy efforts, and I think if you just want a movie which is like a mature screensaver of a movie with kind of meditative music, that's what this kind of film is like. I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.